Juan Mallard. Some choices take seconds to make, but echo across decades. A split second to reach for car keys after a night out. A split second to keep driving instead of stopping. But what happens when those seconds stretch into hours, then days, and the choice transforms from accident into something else entirely? How does someone trained to care for others make a decision to do the opposite when it matters most? Shante John Mallard was born on June 22, 1976, in Fort Worth, Texas. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood and pursued a career helping people. By her mid-20s, Mallard had become a nursing assistant, someone whose job required compassion, attention to medical needs, and a commitment to preserving life. She worked at a retirement home, tending to elderly residents who depended on her care. To colleagues and friends, she seemed reliable, capable, someone building a stable future. But on October 25, 2001, the trajectory of Mallard's life veered in a direction no one could have predicted. That evening, she prepared for a night out at a friend's apartment. Before heading to Joe's Big Bamboo Club, a local nightclub, Mallard consumed alcohol, smoked marijuana, and took ecstasy with her friend, Lizzie Fry. At the club, she continued drinking through the night. Around 2:30 in the morning on October 26th, the two women left together. Fry noticed Mallard's condition and insisted on driving her home first. Around 3 in the morning, Mallard got into her Chevrolet Cavalier alone and began driving home. She traveled along a highway curve from East Loop 820 to US 287 in southeast Fort Worth. The area was a 6-lane highway, relatively quiet in the pre-dawn hours. Gregory Glenn Biggs, a 37-year-old man experiencing homelessness, was walking along that highway. He had once worked as a bricklayer and had a son named Brandon. Recent struggles with mental health and housing instability had left him without a permanent place to stay, but he remained connected to his child and hoped to rebuild his life. What happened next changed both their stories forever. Mallard's vehicle struck Biggs with significant force. The impact sent him over the hood and through her windshield, where his body became lodged. His head and shoulders penetrated the glass and entered the passenger compartment while his legs remained bent over the roof. Medical experts would later confirm that while his injuries were severe, they were not immediately fatal. Biggs remained conscious. He could still speak. He was still breathing. Most people, faced with such a situation, would immediately call for help. Every instinct, every bit of training Mallard had as a healthcare worker should have guided her toward getting medical assistance. Fire stations and police stations existed within a short distance. Her cell phone could have connected her to 911 in seconds. Instead, Mallard briefly stopped her vehicle and attempted to remove Biggs from the windshield. When she realized she could not dislodge him, she made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She kept driving. Mallard drove approximately 1 mile to her home. She pulled her car into her garage, with Biggs still lodged in the windshield, still alive, still in desperate need of medical care. She closed the garage door and went inside her house. Over the next 2 to 3 days, she periodically returned to the garage to check on Biggs. During this time, he remained trapped in her windshield, unable to free himself, slowly losing consciousness as he bled. His pleas for help, if he could still make them, went unanswered. Mallard called her friend Fry and asked her to come over. When Fry arrived and saw Biggs in the garage, she urged Mallard to call 911 immediately. Mallard refused. She told Fry she did not want her parents to know what had happened and did not want to go to jail. Fry left, unwilling to be involved. Biggs died in that garage, still lodged in the windshield, denied the medical care that multiple experts would later confirm could have saved his life. After Biggs passed away, Mallard contacted another friend, Cleet Jackson, for help disposing of the body. Jackson, and his cousin Herbert Tyrone, Cleveland agreed to assist her. Together, they removed Biggs's body from the vehicle and transported it to Cobb Park, where they left it. They attempted to destroy evidence by setting fire to parts of the car. Jackson and Cleveland both later received prison sentences for tampering with evidence, with Jackson sentenced to 10 years and Cleveland to 9 years. For 4 months, authorities had no leads. Then, in February 2002, someone came forward with information. Miranda Daniel told police that she had attended a gathering where Mallard was present. During conversations about designated drivers, Mallard giggled and mentioned that she could not drive because she had hit a man with her car and he had become stuck in her windshield. She laughed as she recounted parts of the story. Daniel reported this to authorities, and investigators began building their case. Mallard was arrested and charged with murder. Her trial began on June 23, 2003. The Tarrant County Medical Examiner, Dr. Nizam Piawani, testified that had Mallard taken Biggs to a hospital, he would have survived his injuries. Captain Jim Sada of the Fort Worth Fire Department stated that any member of his department could have saved Biggs's life with basic first responder care. The evidence made clear that Mallard's actions in the hours and days following the collision directly resulted in Biggs's passing. Defense attorneys argued that the initial collision was an accident, not an intentional act. However, prosecutors emphasized that Mallard's subsequent decisions, driving home with an injured person lodged in her windshield, refusing to call for help, and leaving him to perish in her garage, transformed the situation from an accident into something far more serious. The jury agreed. They found Mallard guilty of murder and tampering with evidence. She received 50 years for murder and 10 years for tampering with evidence, to be served concurrently. Brandon Biggs, Gregory's son, was a high school senior when he received the phone call about his father. He had to plan his father's funeral alone. During the sentencing phase, he testified about the impact of losing his parent in such a way. Years later, remarkably, Brandon would publicly forgive Mallard, an act of grace that drew national attention and earned him recognition for his capacity to move forward despite unimaginable loss. Chante Mallard's case became known nationwide as the windshield incident. It inspired episodes of Law and Order, CSI, and the television series Fargo. A film called Stuck dramatized the events in 2007. The story resonated not because it was complex, but because it was disturbingly simple. One choice led to another, and each choice moved further from help, further from accountability, further from basic human decency. Today, Mallard remains incarcerated in Texas. She became eligible for parole in 2027. Her story serves as a reminder that sometimes the most devastating outcomes begin not with elaborate plans, but with a single moment of panic followed by a series of choices that compound the original harm. Gregory Biggs deserved help that night. Instead, he received abandonment, and that difference between what could have been and what actually happened defines this tragedy. Crystal Gail Mangum. When someone's name becomes synonymous with a national controversy, can they ever escape that shadow? And what happens when the same person who sparked debates about justice, race, and truth finds themselves at the center of an entirely different crime years later? The question lingers. Does past notoriety influence present judgment, or does the weight of evidence stand alone regardless of who carries it? Crystal Gail Mangum was born on July 18, 1978, in Durham, North Carolina. She grew up in challenging circumstances and became a single mother to 3 children while working multiple jobs to support them. Among those jobs was exotic dancing, a profession that would eventually place her at the intersection of one of the most controversial cases in American legal history. But before that moment arrived, Mangum was simply trying to navigate survival, balancing motherhood with work that paid enough to keep food on the table and a roof over her family's heads. March 2006 marked the beginning of the Duke lacrosse case, an incident that would dominate headlines for months and reshape conversations about privilege, race, and the justice system. Mangum claimed that members of the Duke University men's lacrosse team had assaulted her at a party where she had been hired to perform. The allegations triggered an immediate response. District Attorney Mike Nifong pursued charges with intensity, and the case became a media sensation. National news outlets covered every development. The university cancelled the team's season. The coach resigned. 3 players faced serious charges, while their photographs circulated across television screens and newspaper front pages. As months passed, inconsistencies emerged in Mangum's account. Physical evidence failed to support her claims. DNA testing produced results that contradicted her statements. Eventually, North Carolina Attorney General Roy Cooper took over the case and reached a conclusion that stunned many who had followed the story closely. In April 2007, Cooper declared the 3 accused players innocent, stating there was no credible evidence an assault had occurred. Nifong, whose aggressive prosecution had helped fuel the controversy, was later disbarred for his conduct in handling the case. For Mangum, the aftermath proved difficult. She published a memoir maintaining her version of events. Friends described her as struggling with mental health challenges and the stigma that followed her wherever she went. Some saw her as someone who needed support and treatment. Others viewed her as someone who had caused irreparable harm to innocent people. The truth about what happened that night in March 2006 remained contested for years until December 2024, when Mangum finally admitted during a podcast interview that she had fabricated the allegations, stating she had testified falsely and betrayed those who believed her. But the Duke case was not the end of Mangum's encounters with law enforcement. In February 2010, police responded to a call from her 9-year-old daughter. When officers arrived at Mangum's residence, they found her in a confrontation with her partner Milton Walker. She had set fire to some of his clothing in a bathtub while they watched. The building sustained significant smoke damage. Authorities charged her with multiple offenses, including attempted murder, arson, assault, and child endangerment. During a videotaped interrogation, she described the confrontation and admitted to her actions. The attempted murder charge was eventually dropped, but she received a conviction for contributing to the delinquency of a juvenile, property damage, and resisting arrest. 16 months later, on April 3, 2011, emergency services received another call. This time, it came from the nephew of 46-year-old Reginald Day. The nephew told the dispatcher that Crystal Mangum had been involved in an altercation. When police arrived, they found Day with a stab wound to his torso. He was rushed to Duke University Hospital for treatment. Mangum faced immediate arrest and charges of assault with a deadly weapon with intent to inflict serious injury. Day and Mangum had been dating for approximately 1 month, though his family members disputed whether they were actually a couple. They described Day as someone trying to help Mangum get back on her feet by providing her with a place to stay. According to statements Day gave to investigators from his hospital bed, he had ordered Mangum to leave his apartment because he was tired of her bringing other men over. He admitted kicking open a bathroom door and dragging her by her hair, but claimed he was trying to disengage from the argument when she grabbed a knife. 10 days after the incident, on April 13, 2011, Reginald Day passed away from complications related to his injury. The charge against Mangum was upgraded to murder. She remained in custody under a $300,000 bond. The trial took place in November 2013. Mangum maintained that she acted in self-defense, claiming Day had been in a jealous rage, beating and choking her before she grabbed the knife and, in her words, poked him in the side. Prosecutors presented a different narrative. They argued that the physical evidence contradicted her self-defense claim. Medical testimony confirmed that the stab wound and subsequent complications caused Dai's passing. A jury of 7 men and 5 women deliberated for approximately 6 hours across 2 days before delivering their verdict. They found Mangum guilty of second-degree murder. The jury acquitted her of 2 larceny charges related to allegations she had stolen money orders from Dai after the incident. Superior Court Judge Paul Ridgway sentenced Crystal Mangum to 170 to 216 months in prison, equivalent to 14 to 18 years. Dai's family addressed the court during sentencing, describing him as a good man who deserved better treatment. His sister stated that he deserved to still be with them. Defense attorney Daniel Meyer expressed disappointment with the verdict and filed an appeal. Mangum's supporters argued that her past affected the jury's perception, suggesting the conviction stemmed not from evidence, but from public opinion shaped by previous controversies. Prosecutors countered that the trial focused solely on what happened on April 3, 2011, and had nothing to do with events from years earlier. Today, Crystal Mangum remains incarcerated in North Carolina. Prison records indicate her projected release date is February 27, 2026. Her case represents a complex intersection of credibility, consequence, and the lasting impact of choices made under pressure. 2 separate incidents, years apart, yet both ending with her behind bars. The question that haunts this story is whether justice was served purely on the merits of evidence, or whether the weight of notoriety tipped the scales in ways impossible to measure. Reginald Dai's family received a verdict. They felt honored his memory. Crystal Mangum received a sentence that will keep her imprisoned for over a decade. And the broader public continues to debate whether her past shaped her present in ways that extended beyond the courtroom walls. Kimberly McCarthy. Sometimes, the numbers tell a story bigger than any single case. 500. That's how many lives the state of Texas had taken through its execution chamber when Kimberly McCarthy's turn arrived. But to Dorothy Booth's family, there was only one number that mattered. 1. One mother, one grandmother, one life ended over a wedding ring, and a craving that consumed everything in its path. What transforms someone from a healthcare professional helping others into someone capable of taking a life for drug money? And when addiction rewires the brain so completely, where does personal responsibility end and disease begin? Kimberly LaGale McCarthy was born on May 11, 1961 in Greenville, Texas. She completed high school and pursued work that involved caring for others. She trained as an occupational therapist and spent time working in healthcare facilities, assisting elderly patients with daily activities and rehabilitation. For years, she held jobs as a waitress, home healthcare provider, and laborer. Those who knew her during this period saw someone trying to make her way through life with honest work. But somewhere along that journey, McCarthy encountered crack cocaine, and the substance took hold of her in ways that would prove devastating. Addiction specialists describe crack as one of the most powerfully addictive drugs available, creating intense cravings that can override judgment, morality, and self-preservation. McCarthy's life began a downward spiral marked by escalating need for the drug and increasingly desperate measures to obtain it. She accumulated charges for forgery, theft of services, and prostitution. In February 1990, she began serving a 2-year prison sentence for forgery. Authorities released her on parole after 4 months, and she completed her sentence discharge in December 1991. By the mid-1990s, McCarthy had married Aaron Michaels, founder of the New Black Panther Party. The relationship brought her into contact with political activism and community organizing, but the marriage did not last. They had separated by the time July 21, 1997 arrived, the day that would define the rest of McCarthy's short life. Dorothy Booth was 71 years old, a retired psychology professor from El Centro College. She had spent her career teaching students, helping them understand human behavior and development. She lived in Lancaster, a suburb in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, in a comfortable home she had built through years of hard work. Her daughter Donna Aldred later described her as an incredible woman who loved her family deeply. On that July morning, McCarthy's phone rang at Booth's residence. McCarthy asked if she could come over to borrow some sugar. It's an old-fashioned request, the kind neighbors make in friendly communities where people still look out for each other. Booth agreed, perhaps remembering a time when borrowing a cup of sugar was exactly what neighbors did for one another. She had no reason to suspect anything else. When McCarthy arrived, she brought a butcher knife. What happened next, prosecutors would later describe in court testimony. McCarthy attacked Booth, stabbing her 5 times and striking her with a candelabrum. The retired professor fought for her life in her own home. In one of the most disturbing details of the attack, McCarthy severed Booth's left ring finger to steal the diamond wedding ring. Dorothy Booth was still alive when this happened. After taking Booth's life, McCarthy gathered items from the home, including the victim's purse, credit cards, and car keys. She walked out to Booth's Mercedes-Benz, got inside, and drove away. The next morning, dressed for work as if nothing had happened, McCarthy drove Booth's car to a location where she purchased crack cocaine. She pawned the wedding ring for $200. Throughout that day, she used Booth's credit cards at least 4 times at various locations, including a liquor store. When police later recovered Booth's driver's license from McCarthy's possession, the evidence chain began forming. Investigators found the murder weapon, a butcher knife, in McCarthy's home. She had washed it carefully, but forensic experts discovered something crucial. Inside the plastic handle, protected from her cleaning attempts, they found blood. DNA testing matched it to Dorothy Booth. Initially, McCarthy provided a confession to police, though she told a different version of events. According to her statement, 2 drug dealers had been visiting her apartment when her money for drugs ran out. She claimed they asked if she knew anyone they could rob, and when she hesitated, they became verbally abusive and threatened her with harm if she didn't cooperate. She suggested her neighbor, Dorothy Booth. According to this account, the dealers told her to call Booth and ask to borrow sugar as a pretense. McCarthy stated that when they arrived together at Booth's home and the victim opened the door, the dealers went inside, while McCarthy waited outside in Booth's car. She claimed they emerged with Booth's belongings, and they drove away together. McCarthy admitted to driving Booth's car afterward, selling her possessions for drugs, and using her credit cards. At trial, the defense presented no evidence that anyone besides McCarthy was involved. The confession became inadmissible because police had taken it after McCarthy requested a lawyer. A Dallas County jury convicted her of capital murder in November 1998 and sentenced her to death. However, in December 2001, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned the conviction based on the improper use of that confession. Prosecutors tried McCarthy again in 2002. This time, they relied on the physical evidence, the knife with Booth's DNA in the handle, the credit card receipts, the stolen property in McCarthy's possession. The second jury reached the same conclusion as the first and sentenced her to death on November 1st, 2002. McCarthy's case took on additional significance beyond the crime itself. She was black. Dorothy Booth was white. At the retrial, 11 of the 12 jurors were white. McCarthy's attorneys raised concerns about potential racial discrimination in jury selection, pointing to Dallas County's documented history of such practices. The U.S. Supreme Court had addressed this very issue in a 2005 case involving Dallas County prosecutors. But procedural rules prevented McCarthy's claims from being fully examined by the courts. Blood evidence also linked McCarthy to 2 other elderly women who died in December 1988. 81-year-old Maggie Harding, a friend of McCarthy's mother, was stabbed and beaten with a meat tenderizer. 85-year-old Jetty Lucas, a distant relative, was attacked with a claw, hammer, and knife. Both attacks bore similarities to Booth's case. McCarthy was indicted for these deaths but never tried. On June 26, 2013, Kimberly McCarthy was executed by injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She was 52 years old. As the drugs entered her system, she looked toward the window where her supporters sat, including her ex-husband, and thanked them. Her final words referenced going home to Jesus. Dorothy Booth's daughter, Donna Aldred, witnessed the execution and afterward read a statement thanking prosecutors and investigators. After waiting nearly 16 years, she said, the finality of that day's events allowed her to completely say goodbye to her mother. McCarthy became the 500th person executed by Texas since the state resumed capital punishment, a milestone that sparked national debates about the death penalty, racial bias in the justice system, and the role addiction plays in violent crime. She was the first woman executed in the United States since 2010 and the fourth woman executed in Texas since capital punishment resumed in 1976. Her case represents multiple intersecting questions about justice, about whether addiction diminishes culpability, about whether the death penalty is applied fairly across racial lines, about whether someone who once helped others through healthcare work could be the same person who took 3 elderly women's lives for drug money. Courts provided legal answers to these questions, but the moral and ethical dimensions continue to be debated by those who study capital punishment, criminal justice reform, and the devastating impact of addiction on human behavior. Deborah Brown. Can someone with no history of harm transform into a willing participant in terrible acts within weeks of meeting the wrong person? The summer of 1984 forced America to confront this question as 2 people traveled across the Midwest, leaving devastation behind them in a trail that would span 6 states. What makes a person abandon everything they know to follow someone into darkness? And once that line is crossed, can they ever claim they were simply led astray? Deborah Denise Brown was born on November 11th, 1962, in Illinois. She was one of 11 children raised in a household that struggled with economic challenges. During her childhood, she suffered a significant head injury that would later become central to understanding her actions. Psychological evaluations would reveal she had borderline intellectual functioning, with IQ scores measured between 59 and 74 across different tests. Before 1983, Brown had no encounters with law enforcement. She worked, maintained friendships, and was engaged to be married to another man. Those who knew her described a young woman trying to build a stable life despite the obstacles she faced. That changed when she met Alton Coleman in 1983. Coleman was 28 years old, 11 years her senior, and had an extensive history with the justice system. Between 1973 and 1983, he faced charges for intimate offenses 6 times. While some cases were dismissed and others resulted in acquittals, he served prison time for armed robbery involving an assault on a woman. He was scheduled to stand trial in Illinois for charges involving a 14-year-old when he decided to flee instead. Within a short time after meeting Coleman, Brown left her fiancé and moved in with him. Psychiatrists would later diagnose her with dependent personality disorder, describing the relationship as a master-slave dynamic where Brown became completely submissive to Coleman's influence. Her family watched helplessly as she distanced herself from them and attached herself entirely to Coleman. They would later describe it as watching someone they loved disappear into someone else's control. The crime spree began on May 29, 1984, in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Coleman had befriended a single mother and gained her trust. A 9-year-old daughter, Vernita Wheat, disappeared that day. Her body would not be discovered until June 19th. From Wisconsin, the pair traveled to Gary, Indiana, where on June 18th they encountered 2 young girls, 9-year-old Annie and her 7-year-old niece, Tamika Turks, walking back from a candy store. Brown and Coleman convinced them to walk into nearby woods to play a game. What happened there would become the crime for which Brown received a death sentence in Indiana. Annie survived. Tamika did not. The same day Tamika's body was discovered, Coleman and Brown took 25-year-old Donna Williams and her vehicle. Williams's body was found 2 days later. The pattern continued through Michigan and Ohio. In Dearborn, Michigan, they attacked a couple in their home, taking money and their vehicle before continuing on. On July 5th in Toledo, Ohio, they attacked Virginia Temple and her 9-year-old daughter Rochelle in their home. Both mother and child lost their lives. After those attacks, the pair visited Reverend and Mrs. Millard Gay in Dayton, Ohio, staying with the couple for several days and even attending religious services with them. The Gays, unaware of who their guests truly were, dropped Coleman and Brown in downtown Cincinnati. 2 days later, on July 12th, 15-year-old Tawny Story was attacked and lost her life in Over the Rhine, Ohio. That same day, 44-year-old Marlene Walters was beaten in her Norwood, Ohio home. She passed away from her injuries days later. On July 17th, 77-year-old Eugene Scott of Indianapolis became the final victim when Coleman and Brown took his vehicle. By this point, Coleman had been added to the FBI's 10 most wanted list. Law enforcement across multiple states coordinated their search efforts. On July 20th, 1984, the two were recognized in Evanston, Illinois by someone who knew Coleman. When police arrived, they found the pair sitting on bleachers in an empty park. Coleman had a knife, and officers discovered bags containing multiple hats and shirts, items used to change their appearance as they moved through neighborhoods. The legal proceedings that followed were complex. More than 50 law enforcement officials from 6 jurisdictions met to determine prosecution strategy. Authorities agreed to give Ohio first opportunity, with U.S. Attorney Dan K. Webb stating that Ohio offered the swiftest path to death penalty convictions. Both Coleman and Brown were tried and convicted in Ohio for multiple counts. Both received death sentences. During her sentencing phase in Ohio, Brown sent a note to the judge. Unrepentant at that time, the note contained language that demonstrated a callousness that shocked those in the courtroom. She was also sentenced to death in Indiana for Tamika Turks's passing. However, her intellectual limitations became central to clemency discussions. In 1991, Ohio Governor Richard Celeste, a strong opponent of capital punishment, commuted the death sentences of 8 Ohio death row inmates during his final week in office. Brown was among them, with Celeste specifically citing her low IQ scores and the master-slave relationship with Coleman as factors in his decision. Her Indiana death sentence was later commuted to 140 years in 2018. Coleman received death sentences from 3 different states, making him the only condemned person in the country with that distinction at the time of his execution. On April 26, 2002, Ohio executed him by injection at the correctional facility in Lucasville. He was 46 years old. Deborah Brown remains incarcerated in Ohio, serving life without possibility of parole. She is no longer on any state's death row list. Her case continues to raise questions about culpability, intellectual disability, and the extent to which one person can control another. 8 people lost their lives during that summer in 1984. Families across 6 states were left to process grief and search for answers that might never fully satisfy. Brown's defenders point to her documented intellectual limitations and complete dependence on Coleman as evidence she was a victim of his manipulation. Prosecutors countered that regardless of her relationship with Coleman, she participated willingly in acts that resulted in deaths. The debate over her responsibility versus her vulnerability continues among legal scholars and advocates on both sides of capital punishment discussions. Today, The case of Deborah Brown stands as one of the most complex examples of partnership in crime American justice has confronted. Was she an equal participant, or someone whose limitations made her susceptible to domination by a manipulative partner? Courts delivered their verdicts. Governors exercised clemency. But the fundamental question of how much agency Brown possessed during those terrible weeks in 1984 may never be fully resolved. Raya and Sakina. When does desperation cross the line into something unforgivable? When does survival become an excuse for the inexcusable? These questions haunted Alexandria, Egypt in the early 1920s, when women began disappearing from the Laban neighborhood without explanation. Their families left to wonder if they would ever see them again. Can poverty justify predation? Or does economic hardship simply reveal what was always waiting beneath the surface? Raya was born around 1875 in a village in Upper Egypt, though exact records from that era remain scarce. Her younger sister, Sakina, arrived roughly a decade later, around 1885. The family moved several times throughout the sisters' childhood, struggling against the same financial pressures that affected countless Egyptian families during that period. Life offered few opportunities for women born into poverty, and the paths available to Raya and Sakina were narrow from the start. Raya married young, but her first husband passed away while she carried their child. Following tradition, she married his younger brother Hasbullah, who likely felt duty-bound to care for his brother's widow and nephew. The marriage brought no prosperity. Hasbullah had a history of theft and served 6 months in prison around 1912. Raya herself spent 6 months incarcerated in 1916 after taking responsibility for one of her husband's crimes. The couple had 6 children together, but only one survived infancy, a loss that must have marked them both. Sakina's journey followed a different but equally difficult trajectory. Her first husband divorced her 2 years into their marriage, shortly after their daughter passed away. With few options available, Sakina turned to regulated intimate work, an accepted though heavily controlled profession in Egypt during that time. She became ill, likely with a transmitted disease, and spent extended time in a hospital where she met a nurse named Ahmed Rajab. The two fell in love and escaped together to Alexandria in 1913, hoping the Mediterranean port city would offer them a fresh start. Raya followed her sister to Alexandria 3 years later. In 1916, the sisters reunited in the Laban neighborhood, located just minutes from both the train station and the port. World War I had plunged Egypt into economic crisis. British colonial rule complicated every aspect of daily life. Ahmed Rajab left Sakina to find work with the Allied war effort, leaving her to support herself alone. The sisters began managing houses where intimate workers operated, navigating a world of clients, informants, British officers, and Egyptian officials. It was a world that existed in shadows, beyond the full reach of colonial authority. Between December 20th, 1919, and November 12th, 1920, 17 women vanished from the Laban district. Most were engaged in intimate work. Many were last seen in the company of Raya or Sakina. Police received numerous missing person reports, but investigations led nowhere. The women seemed to have simply disappeared into thin air. The discovery came accidentally in November 1920. An elderly man reported a shocking find to police after workers began installing sewage systems in a building his family managed. While digging for water pipes, they unearthed skeletal remains. The body was believed to be that of Nabawiya bint Ali, who had gone missing 3 months earlier. The building had previously been rented by Sakina, which immediately drew police attention. Authorities began searching all properties associated with the sisters. What they found horrified the city. Beneath the floors of multiple homes rented by Raya and Sakina, investigators discovered the remains of 17 women. Bodies had been buried under tiles that were then carefully reset to hide any evidence of disturbance. One of these homes sat directly beside the El Laban police station itself, a detail that sent shockwaves through the community. How had so many women died and been buried so close to law enforcement without anyone noticing? Witnesses came forward with information. Several people reported seeing missing women with the sisters before they vanished. One friend noticed Sakina wearing a distinctive shawl that had belonged to a disappeared woman named Firdaus, a gift from a British client. When the British man saw Sakina wearing it, he accompanied her to the police station, triggering the investigation that would unravel everything. The investigation revealed a criminal operation involving 6 people: Raya and her husband Hasbullah, Sakina and her husband Muhammad Abdelal, plus 2 accomplices named Orabi Hassan and Abdel Razik Yosef. The gang targeted women who wore expensive jewelry, luring them to one of 4 rented homes with offers of work, companionship, or assistance. Once inside, the sisters would offer wine and liquor until their victim became intoxicated. The 4 men would then attack, restraining the woman before placing a wet cloth over her mouth to end her life. They would steal jewelry, money, and clothing, then bury the body beneath the floor tiles. The sisters sold the stolen jewelry to a local merchant named Ali Hassan, and the 6 criminals divided the proceeds. The trial in May 1921 became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in Egyptian history. Newspapers seized on the story, but research suggests they focused disproportionately on the sisters, while referring to the men simply as their husbands or accomplices. The sisters were branded as immoral and accused of public indecency, language designed to captivate readers rather than accurately represent the facts. Modern historians have questioned whether Raya and Sakina were used as scapegoats to target underground intimate work in Alexandria under British colonial rule. Regardless of the broader political context, the jury found all 6 defendants guilty. On December 21, 1921, Raya and Sakina were executed by hanging, becoming the first women put to death under the modern Egyptian judicial system. Their husbands and the 2 male accomplices were also executed. Raya's daughter Badiya, who had provided testimony against her family, was sent to an orphanage. She died there at age 16 in a fire, though whether the blaze was intentional remains unknown. The house where bodies were discovered still stands in the Laban neighborhood. It has become a tourist attraction, with paintings depicting the sisters hung on its walls. Over a century later, their names remain synonymous with betrayal and violence in Egyptian popular culture. Films, television series, plays, and books have dramatized their story repeatedly since the 1950s, cementing their place in collective memory. But questions persist. Were they masterminds or merely participants in a larger criminal network? Were they scapegoats for systemic issues surrounding poverty and regulated intimate work under colonial rule? Or were they simply people who chose to harm others for financial gain, regardless of the circumstances that shaped their lives? 17 women lost their lives. 17 families never received closure until bodies were finally recovered. And 2 sisters whose names became icons of horror left behind a legacy that Egypt still grapples with today. The truth, like so much from that era, remains buried beneath layers of sensationalism, political manipulation, and the passage of time. Mitchell Blair. Eviction notices are routine paperwork in America's housing courts. Court officers show up, process the documents, begin clearing belongings. It's mundane work, administrative duty, carried out thousands of times across the country every year. But on March 24, 2015, what should have been another forgettable eviction in Detroit became something else entirely. When you open a freezer expecting frozen food and find frozen children instead, how does your mind even process that information? And what kind of person continues living their daily life with such a presence in their home? Mitchell Angela Blair was born on September 25, 1978, in Detroit, Michigan. She grew up in the same city where she would eventually raise 4 children of her own. 2 of those children shared their father, Alexander Dorsey. The other 2 shared theirs, Stephen Berry. Neither man maintained consistent involvement in their children's lives. Berry later acknowledged he could have done more, while Dorsey claimed Blair prevented him from seeing his kids, an assertion she disputed. Blair kept her children out of school and largely isolated from the outside world. When neighbors asked about Stoney or Stephen, she always had explanations ready. They were visiting relatives. They were staying elsewhere. The excuses satisfied casual curiosity, and without the children enrolled in any school system, no teachers or administrators noticed their absence. The fathers remained distant. No one filed missing person reports. For years, 2 children simply disappeared from public view without triggering any official concern. The family lived at the Martin Luther King Apartments on Detroit's East Side. Blair fell behind on rent, and in early 2015, the housing court issued an eviction order. On that March morning, court officers arrived to carry out their duties. They entered the apartment and began the standard process of documenting belongings. One officer opened a deep freezer, expecting to find typical frozen items. Instead, he discovered something that would make this one of the most notorious child abuse cases in Michigan history. Inside the freezer, covered in plastic, were the bodies of 2 children. Medical examiners would need 3 days for the bodies to thaw before they could perform autopsies. The remains were identified as 13-year-old Stoney Ann Blair and 9-year-old Stephen Gage Berry. Authorities determined Stephen died in August 2012, and Stoney passed away 9 months later, in May 2013. They had been stored in that freezer for nearly 3 years. At the moment officers made their discovery, Mitchell Blair was not at home. She was at a neighbor's apartment, babysitting for someone else's infant. When police located her there with her 2 surviving children, an 8-year-old son and 17-year-old daughter, witnesses heard her speaking on the phone. Her words were heard clearly. "They're both dead. I did it." As officers placed her in handcuffs, she told them she was not an evil person. Blair confessed immediately to taking her children's lives. Her stated reason: she believed Stoney and Stephen had been involved in inappropriate conduct with her youngest son. She claimed she had called police with a hypothetical scenario, asking whether reporting such allegations would result in all her children being removed from her custody. When she learned they likely would be, she decided against involving authorities. No evidence ever substantiated her accusations. Her oldest daughter later stated there was no concrete proof supporting Blair's claims. Prosecutors found nothing to indicate any assault had occurred. The details of what happened to Stephen and Stoney emerged through court proceedings. Blair admitted to repeatedly attacking both children over extended periods. She poured scalding water on them, causing Stephen's skin to peel away from the thermal injuries. She forced him to drink window cleaner. She placed plastic bags over his head until he lost consciousness. When he tore through the bags to breathe, she found tougher materials. She wrapped a belt around his neck. She beat him with her fists. Stephen was 9 years old when he died. Months later, Blair turned her attention to Stoney. She beat the 13-year-old girl repeatedly. She burned her with an iron and poured rubbing alcohol on the wounds. She attacked her until Stoney also passed away. Blair admitted to Judge Dana Hathaway that she intended to take Stoney's life. Regarding Stephen, she claimed she didn't realize the level of harm she was inflicting would prove fatal, though she later stated she felt proud of what she did. Her 2 surviving children also bore the marks of her treatment. Her 8-year-old son told social workers he was whipped with cords. Her 17-year-old daughter described being struck with a hammer, burned with an iron, and having alcohol poured on her injuries. Neither child had received medical care because Blair feared the scars would prompt questions. Blair's case moved through the courts with unusual speed. She wanted to plead guilty immediately, telling the judge she freely accepted life in prison and would have accepted the death penalty if Michigan had that option. Prosecutors initially charged her with felony murder, premeditated murder, torture, and child abuse. On June 29, 2015, she pleaded guilty to first-degree murder without any negotiated deal, an extremely rare move. During her hearing, Judge Hathaway questioned her extensively about her actions. Blair showed no emotion as she confirmed the details. When asked if she regretted her actions, she stated clearly, "I don't regret none of this." She told the judge she felt no remorse because Stoney had no remorse for what Blair believed she had done. If given another chance, Blair said she would do it all again. She referred to her deceased children as demons. On July 17, 2015, Judge Hathaway sentenced Mitchell Blair to life in prison without possibility of parole. The judge told Blair she had created a house of horrors for her 4 children. She stated that Blair had imposed the death penalty on her own children and violated her primary responsibility as a mother to protect them. A joint memorial service was held for Stoney and Stephen. Their surviving siblings were placed in protective custody, with Blair's aunt Angela Gordon initially taking temporary guardianship. Proceedings to terminate Blair's parental rights to her surviving children moved forward, and in July 2015, Judge Edward Joseph permanently ended those rights. Blair did not contest the termination. Today, Mitchell Blair remains incarcerated in Michigan, serving her life sentence without parole. Stephen would be 21 years old now. Stoney would be 25. Instead, they spent their final years in a home where the person meant to protect them became the source of their harm. 2 children vanished from society without anyone noticing, until court officers arrived to process an eviction and opened a freezer that should have contained nothing more significant than frozen meals. The case of Mitchell Blair forces difficult questions about how children can disappear so completely in modern America, about the systems designed to protect vulnerable young people and how those systems can fail so totally, about fathers who remained largely absent from their children's lives, about neighbors who accepted excuses without pressing further, and about a mother who showed no remorse, even when facing a judge who would determine her fate. 3 years those children spent in that freezer while life continued around them. And the person responsible for their care went about her days, even babysitting other people's children on the morning her secret was finally discovered. Wanda Jean Allen. What drives someone to pull a trigger in front of the very people sworn to protect and serve? Some acts defy logic so completely that they reveal something darker than rage, something beyond the boundaries most minds refuse to cross. When someone ends a life in a police station parking lot, with officers just yards away, what calculation runs through their head? Or does calculation even factor into it anymore? Wanda Jean Allen entered this world on August 17, 1959, the second child in a family that would eventually grow to 8 children. Her early years unfolded in the shadows of poverty. Public housing became home. Government assistance put food on the table. Her mother battled alcoholism, while her father simply vanished after the youngest child arrived. These details paint a picture many know too well, but they do not excuse what came later. Childhood trauma marked Allen in ways that would echo through decades. At 12 years old, a truck struck her, leaving her unconscious. Just a few years later, someone stabbed her in the left temple. Medical professionals would later point to these injuries as potential sources of brain damage, cognitive issues that might explain but never justify the violence that followed. June 29, 1981. Allen shared an apartment with Deidre Pettis, someone she had known since childhood. Their friendship had evolved into something more complicated, more intimate. That summer day, An argument erupted between them. Alan pulled out a weapon and took Pettis's life. When questioned by authorities, Alan claimed she fired from roughly 30 feet away, defending herself against Pettis's boyfriend. The physical evidence told a different story. Bruises covered Pettis's body. Powder burns marked her skin in ways consistent with close contact. Investigators concluded Alan had struck Pettis with the weapon before firing at point-blank range. The legal system offered Alan a deal. Plead guilty to manslaughter. Serve 4 years. She accepted. 2 years later, she walked free. 7 years would pass. 7 years during which Alan could have chosen a different path. Instead, history repeated itself with devastating precision. Behind bars, Alan met Gloria Jean Leathers. Both women were serving time for taking lives. Both would eventually be released. Leathers reached out to Alan after her release, and they began living together in Oklahoma City. Those who knew them described their relationship as turbulent, marked by frequent conflict and reconciliation cycles that never seemed to break. December 2nd, 1988, started with a confrontation at a grocery store. Police intervened, escorting both women back to their residence, so Leathers could gather her belongings. An officer stood watch as Leathers packed, attempting to ensure things remained civil. Before leaving, Alan asked Leathers to stay, to work through their problems together. Leathers refused. When Leathers drove to the village police department with her mother to file a complaint, Alan followed. She later claimed she only wanted to convince Leathers not to leave. But intention and action often diverge, especially when weapons enter the equation. Alan approached Leathers in the police station parking lot. Witnesses saw her reach into her clothing and produce a handgun. From just feet away, she fired a single round into Leathers' abdomen. Leathers collapsed as police officers inside the building heard the shot echo across the pavement. 3 days later, on December 5th, 1988, Gloria Jean Leathers passed away from her wound. Oklahoma prosecutors moved swiftly, charging Alan with murder in the first degree and announcing their intention to seek the death penalty. During the trial, prosecutors presented letters Alan had written to Leathers, correspondence containing possessive language and veiled threats. One particular line stood out. Alan had written about being the type of person who would hunt down someone she loved. The jury delivered a guilty verdict. The sentencing phase brought renewed attention to Dedra Pettis's death. Prosecutors drew parallels between the two cases, noting that Alan had concealed firearms in both incidents. The pattern was undeniable. Alan received a sentence of death. Years passed. Appeals moved through the courts while Alan remained on death row. Her legal team raised questions about her mental capacity, pointing to that IQ score of 69 from her teenage years, to the head injuries, to what they argued was inadequate legal representation during her original trial. Civil rights organizations joined the chorus of voices seeking clemency, citing concerns about bias related to her race, sexuality, and cognitive limitations. Governor Frank Keating denied clemency requests. Federal courts declined to intervene. On January 11, 2001, at Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, Wanda Jean Allen became the first woman executed in Oklahoma since 1903 and the first black woman executed in America since 1954. 24 relatives of both victims attended. As the process began, Allen spoke her final words, quoting scripture before displaying behavior witnesses found difficult to interpret. The case of Wanda Jean Allen forces uncomfortable questions about justice, about mental capacity, about cycles of violence that seem impossible to escape. 2 women lost their lives. Families grieved losses that could never be restored. And one woman's journey from poverty and trauma to that final room in McAlester became a flashpoint for national debates about capital punishment that continue today. LaShandra Armstrong, Firefighters expect many things when someone arrives at their station door seeking help. A medical emergency, a report of smoke, perhaps someone needing directions. But when 10-year-old LaShawn Armstrong showed up at the Newburgh Fire Department soaking wet and shivering on the evening of April 12, 2011, he brought a message that would haunt everyone who heard it. His mother had just driven into the Hudson River with him and his 3 younger siblings inside the minivan. What breaks inside a person's mind to transform them from a mother playing with her children in the afternoon to someone capable of driving them into a river that same evening? And when that breaking point arrives, how many warning signs get missed by the people standing closest? LaShandra Renee Armstrong was born in 1976 and grew up to become a single mother of 4 children in Newburgh, New York, a small city of roughly 30,000 residents, located about 60 miles north of New York City along the Hudson River. She had her oldest son, LaShawn, from a previous relationship. Her 3 younger children, 5-year-old Landon Pierre, 2-year-old Lance Pierre, and 11-month-old Lainina Pierre, shared the same father, Jean Pierre, who was her longtime boyfriend, though they were never married. To neighbors and friends, in her working-class neighborhood on Williams Street, Armstrong appeared to be managing the challenges of single motherhood with dedication and energy. Carmen Davila, a neighbor, described her as someone always busy, always responsible with those kids, frequently seen playing outside with them. Another neighbor noted she seemed like the kind of parent who stayed actively involved in her children's lives. She had enrolled in Orange County Community College while sending her children to daycare. Desiree Watson, who directed the daycare center, remembered Armstrong as a devoted mother who maintained her commitment to both education and parenting. But beneath that outward appearance, Armstrong was struggling with challenges her neighbors didn't fully see. She had been unemployed for over a year before finally finding part-time work at a polo factory in November 2010. Money pressures affected every aspect of her life. Her relationship with Jean Pierre was turbulent, marked by frequent arguments. A downstairs neighbor who preferred not to be identified told reporters the couple often fought over Pierre's alleged involvement with other women. From the outside, it looks perfect, the neighbor said. But from the inside, there were many things going on between them. In the weeks leading up to April 12th, Armstrong's behavior began changing in ways that concerned her family. Her aunt, Angela Gilliam, later told reporters that Armstrong had become sporadically communicative during the final 2 weeks of her life. She grew paranoid, convinced people were watching her and that pages from her personal diary were missing. She had filed for a protective order against Pierre, though family members were unsure whether she knew it had been granted earlier on April 12th, the same day tragedy struck. That afternoon, Gilliam spoke with her niece by phone. Armstrong seemed distressed, but tried to reassure her aunt. "I'm okay. I'll be all right, Auntie," she told Gilliam. They discussed plans for Lainina's upcoming first birthday party, scheduled for April 20th. Armstrong told her aunt she would just have a simple cake instead of the larger celebration they had been planning. "Now there will be no party," was destroyed by those words. Around 8 o'clock that evening, worried relatives called 911 after receiving a disturbing phone call from Armstrong's residence. They could hear the children screaming in the background. "When I left my house, I called 911, Gilliam explained. Police were dispatched to Armstrong's apartment, located just 6 blocks from the Hudson River waterfront. But Armstrong had already left with all 4 children in her minivan. She drove to the boat ramp area near Front Street, a location fishermen and boaters used to access the river. Without hesitation, she accelerated down the ramp and drove directly into the frigid 45-degree water. The minivan quickly began sinking beneath the surface. Inside the vehicle, LaShawn managed to activate the power window, which was still functioning despite the water entering the minivan. He rolled it down, squeezed through the opening, and swam toward shore. The young boy pulled himself onto the boat ramp, turned around, and watched his family's vehicle disappear beneath the dark water. Suffering from early stages of hypothermia and barely able to speak, he ran to the nearest fire station and delivered his message to firefighter Lieutenant Joaquin Torres. Torres initially thought the wet, shivering child needed air for his bicycle tires. Then he realized LaShawn was crying, repeating the same words over and over. "Help my mommy. Help my mommy and the baby." Fire Chief Michael Vatter and Police Chief Michael Ferrara immediately coordinated rescue efforts. Dive teams and police boats converged on the location. The minivan had sunk completely and rested below the surface in the murky water. It took approximately 1 hour to locate the vehicle and extract it using a heavy-duty tow truck. When recovery teams finally pulled the minivan from the river around 9 o'clock that evening, they found Armstrong and her 3 youngest children still inside. All 4 were deceased. Newburgh Mayor Nicholas Valentine stood at the scene and told gathered media that the tragedy would have a lasting effect on the city. "No matter what type of investigating you do, this will always be something that will be remembered in a sad way," he stated. Medical examiners later confirmed that all 3 children, Landon, Lance, and Lainina, were alive when the minivan entered the water. The cause of their passing was determined to be drowning. Armstrong also drowned, making the incident a murder-suicide. The aftermath brought additional pain to an already devastated situation. Armstrong's funeral was held on Thursday, April 21st. Jean-Pierre, the children's father, decided the 3 children would be buried separately from their mother. Their service took place on Monday, April 25th, at a private ceremony in Spring Valley, New York, followed by burial in nearby Congas. Emotions ran high as the 2 families struggled with their grief and their disagreements about funeral arrangements. Police assisted funeral staff in keeping the families separated during the children's service. LaShawn did not attend his siblings' funeral. It was too much for him, Gilliam explained to reporters. He had attended his mother's service days earlier. At the boat ramp, where Armstrong drove into the river, mourners created a memorial with stuffed animals, balloons, and flowers. For weeks, visitors left tributes to the 3 children whose lives ended in those cold waters, and to the mother whose mental state had deteriorated to the point where she saw no other option. The case of LaShandra Armstrong raised difficult questions about maternal mental health, domestic relationships, economic stress, and the systems designed to intervene before tragedies occur. Armstrong had been unemployed for over a year. She was navigating a difficult relationship marked by infidelity accusations. She had filed for protection, but may not have known help was coming. Her family noticed changes in her behavior, but could not have predicted this outcome. Friends saw a devoted mother. Neighbors observed someone working hard to provide for her children while pursuing education. And yet, on that April evening, something inside her broke completely. LaShawn survived physically, but carries the weight of that night forward. 3 children never got to grow up. Landon never saw his 6th birthday. Lance was only 2. Lainina never celebrated turning 1. And their mother, who once played with them on William Street, while neighbors watched approvingly, drove them into darkness and water, ending 4 lives, including her own. The boat ramp in Newburgh remains a permanent reminder of the fragility of mental health and the devastating consequences when someone feels they have no way out except to take everyone with them.